So we are continuing in our series that we're calling The Way, and we're taking time to look at how the resurrection really impacts the lives of people. And so we're looking at the lives of the people who were right there in the moment when Jesus rose from the dead, but also how it impacts us today, right? And so I just think it's good for us to just drill down on this, not just on Easter Sunday, but to just kind of keep moving in that. And so that's what we're going to do. We're not going to rush ahead. I don't want us to ever get to the point where we think of the resurrection of Jesus as old news, right? Just because we've heard it a lot. And I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to kind of view it that way, especially in our culture where we're constantly grabbing for the latest headline or the latest trend or what's fresh, what's cutting edge, okay? But the resurrection of Jesus isn't something that ever gets old. This is the game changer of all game changers in our lives, because it's in his death and resurrection that Jesus has broken through anything and everything that could ever hold us back or hold us down in life from following after him. Life that's filled with purpose, life that's filled with hope, all of that, all of those chains have been broken so that we can step into this, because now we have this sure foundation of Jesus. And it's this life that he has for us where we can now experience breakthrough. That's what he has come, and he's opened a way for us to step into. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today, a little more. The year was 1947. The place was the Mojave Desert when a massive breakthrough took place. Now, for years, the U.S. Air Force had been trying to push beyond the sound barrier. It seemed like they would get close only to end up being denied. Something would happen. They'd have to abort. It was this invisible wall that seemed impenetrable. Finally, in 1947, with the help of Chuck Yeager as the pilot of this experimental plane, they thought they had a chance. Now, I say experimental plane because this thing, while it looks like a jet, was really a little bit more than a glorified glider that had 4 rockets strapped to it. It had just enough fuel for the test before it would run out, and he would have to glide this thing safely back to some remote part of that Mojave Desert. The day of the flight came, and even that day they faced some massive challenges. As they approached the speed of sound, the flight controls locked up. The plane began to shake because they hit massive turbulence. On top of that, Chuck Yeager was recovering from a couple of cracked ribs from falling off a horse just 2 days before. He's in immense pain as they're moving through. And yet he kept pushing through. And then suddenly it happened. The ground controllers heard a sonic boom for the first time. Chuck Yeager punched through history and the sound barrier as the first supersonic pilot. And it was a massive breakthrough, over 12 years in the making. I think we all love stories like that because we all want breakthrough in our life. It's just something we long for. So we love stories about breakthrough. We've all faced these moments in our lives where we come up against what feels like this invisible wall. Okay, and probably for you, and I definitely know for me, it's not the sound barrier. But many times it does come in the form of things that we've talked about often, things like conflict. Conflict in the home between spouses, or maybe it's between the children and sibling rivalry, or maybe it's between parents and children and there's just conflict there. Maybe it's conflict at work over difficult expectations or even more difficult attitudes. Sometimes it's really spiritual conflict that we face, where seems to be this resistance that God is calling me to move in this area, but it seems like there's this force that's pushing against me. Okay, and sometimes it's not resistance as much as it is reluctance. I know what God's calling me to do, but I just fail to do it. Sometimes it's a combo. But conflict is definitely one of those walls that we face. We just want breakthrough. At other times, it's not conflict, but it's this other one that we talk about a lot, these crossroad points in our lives. This decision point. And I'm not talking about, what to have for lunch after service today, or what movie or show to watch maybe throughout the week. It's major life decisions that we're focusing on here, right? What school do I attend? Do I take the job or do I stay where I am? Do I seek the treatment plan? Right? Major life issues. Sometimes it's the dance of what do I need to do and how can I cut expenses so that I can afford the new car that I need or the house, or so I can just pay the bills and keep on top of things. It's these decisions that kind of change the course of our lives, and sometimes we just want some breakthrough clarity, don't we? Along with this, obviously, then are also these crisis moments. Life just strikes out of the blue, and you're not expecting, and suddenly you're facing the situation that's larger than you. And so it could be the unexpected phone call in the middle of the night that we all dread. Or maybe it's news that your job is ending. Or maybe it's when you're at the doctor's office and he comes in and says, I'm sorry, but this disease is bigger than we thought it was. These and many more are just moments where life just suddenly shifts on you and you just don't know what to do. But you just long for breakthrough, just a glimpse of light at the end of what feels like a very dark tunnel. We all experience moments where we just want breakthrough. We just long for it. And I think longing for breakthrough is a great way to describe Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples. Now, we often don't think of him in those terms as longing for breakthrough. In fact, most of the time, we kind of view him in a very different light, don't we? We know him as the doubter, right? History just kind of rings with that name, Doubting Thomas. He's kind of the negative Ned of the discipleship group, right? That's kind of how we view him. But I got to tell you, I'm just not convinced that he was. Now, I get that we have this moment after Easter Sunday throughout that week when Jesus appeared, he appears on that first Easter Sunday to the disciples, but Thomas is missing, right? He's not there. And that brings us to this doubting moment a day or so later maybe when the disciples who did see Jesus find Thomas. And this is what we read. So the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. But Thomas said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and I put my fingers where those nails were, and I put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Right? And can you really blame him? I mean, he saw Jesus arrested. He was there in the garden. From what he shares here about Jesus' wounds, you almost wonder if he watched him be crucified maybe from a distance from this safe place. And just how many people do you know who have died and then 3 days later were very much alive? Right? I've got to say, I don't know anyone like that. And so in this moment, he's wrestling, and I think we get that. I think we can understand and kind of sympathize with him. But here's what we also know about Thomas, right? We look at this as the doubting moment, but here's also what we know. When everyone else was afraid to follow Jesus back to Jerusalem, Thomas was willing to go. Last week I shared his comment, let us go so that we too may die with him, right? It's this high drama moment in his life. But at the same time, it shows his commitment to Jesus and it shows his courage. They're heading into the lion's den. Everyone else is quaking. Thomas says, let's go. Later in the upper room, as they're sharing that Last Supper moment, Jesus starts talking about and explaining again how he's going to die. And he's about to go away, is how he puts it. It's Thomas who speaks up in the moment, and he says, Jesus, I just don't understand. I need some clarity, is how we could paraphrase that. He doesn't speak up because he doubts Jesus. He speaks up because he says, man, I want to follow. I just don't know where you're going. Right? So it's not doubt in that moment. And so while Thomas definitely wrestles with believing what the other disciples are telling him when they say that Jesus had appeared to them, while he has his doubts, I think at the same time, he's just really longing for breakthrough. He wants a way to push beyond where he is because he's just stuck. And it's just a few days later that breakthrough took place in his life. Here's what we read beginning in verse 26. A week later, Jesus' disciples were in the house again, and Thomas now was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus still came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." I mean, it's this massive breakthrough moment when Thomas saw Jesus, and we see it as he just erupts in this move of what we could only call worship and surrender, as he says, "My Lord and my God." Right? It's this declaration of who Jesus is, and Thomas is the first to confess that he is God. But it's also this huge declaration of this change in Thomas's life, this massive breakthrough of faith, right? Because it's more than just titles of Jesus here. It's this personal declaration of Jesus, you are my Lord. You are the leader of my life. That's what he's saying. And he also says, you are my God. You are greater. You are bigger than anything and everything. Jesus, you are more than enough. You are all that I need. It's this breakthrough faith declaration. And in the midst of his situation, in the midst of his circumstances, something in Thomas changed. And I want that to sink in. That it's in the midst of this situation that's ongoing that something inside of him flipped. It's in the midst of the Jewish authorities still looking for Jesus' disciples. And Jesus' disciples are still trying to figure out, okay, Jesus died and he rose from the dead. That happened. What do we do now? There's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, if there's anyone that's involved in conflict, it's this group. If there's anyone looking at a crossroads moment, it's this group. They're still reeling from the crisis of Jesus being killed just a few days before. I mean, it's this huge situation that they're facing, but even bigger is that Thomas experiences breakthrough. Now, I say that that's bigger because a lot of times when we experience breakthrough, we judge whether or not we've experienced it on the external. What's going on in our situation. How fast God moves to flip the situation. How fast God responds to my prayer in the way that I prayed it, in the way that I want Him to respond, to bring healing or to bring provision or to meet this need that I've been praying for, that I've been wrestling with, right? So we equate breakthrough with God's response in my way. The external. Okay, and sometimes God moves the way that we hope that He will move, and He just turns everything on its head that's facing us in life, and we love it, and we praise God because He is good when He moves, right? And we love it when He moves on our behalf like that. Okay, but many times God moves in a deeper way that brings breakthrough in us in the midst of our circumstances. And if I could just bottle up what I'm trying to say to you today, it would be this. As hard as it is to accept, I think here's the truth that we need. It's more important that God changes you than it is that God changes your situation. I'm going to say that again because I really want this to sink in. It is more important that God changes you than it is that God changes your situation. Okay, so why is that? Because regardless of what you and I face in this world, we need to remember it's just temporary. It's just temporary. And I get that some of what we face is pretty intense, right? But in the face of eternity, this disease, this loss, this struggle, this crisis, this decision that I've got to make, this situation is just a blip and it will be gone. And I'm not saying that to dismiss your pain or to trivialize the struggle of what you're going through. I'm trying to help you get a greater perspective today. Because what ultimately matters isn't how your situation changes for your comfort or my comfort, but how you rise up to face this moment. Amen. How you respond. And what God is doing in you is that He is changing you inside so that the very character of Jesus becomes your character. So that you respond to situations the way that Jesus would respond. Right? And so we respond in full trust in God, full courage in the moment, fully faithful. And that your life in this moment seeks something way beyond your immediate comfort. You long to bring glory to God. Right? That's something very different. Glory now that God can use to turn and to heal more lost and broken people because they see Him in you and in what you're going through. You with me? And so your primary focus changes from, oh God, rescue me and bring comfort to me in this moment, to, God, may you be glorified in me and through me in this moment. Amen. You see the difference? Now, it's not wrong to ask God to bring an end to the pain and struggle. That's okay to do. Jesus even prayed for that before His death on the cross. But His primary focus was not on His personal comfort. It was on the Father's will. You remember? And so His prayer becomes ours as we turn to God and we say, God, rescue me, but not my will, but yours be done. Yeah? Amen. I'm seeking your glory, not my comfort. It is more important that God changes you than it is that God changes your situation. And I want us to just personalize this today. I want you to say this out loud with me. I'll get out of the way so you can see the screen. It's more important that God changes me, say this with me, than it is that God changes my situation. Let's say it again. It's more important that God changes me than it is that God changes my situation. That's the real breakthrough faith that God longs to bring into your life and mine. Okay? Now, I get that that sounds good, theoretically. I also get that this is harder sometimes to put into practice than we might think. Okay? And so how do we do this? Because spiritual breakthrough is not something that you and I can just manufacture in the moment. It's really not about us pushing harder like Chuck Yeager did as he just burst through the sound barrier. That works for jet planes. It doesn't work in life so much. Okay? Instead of pushing harder and trying harder, it's about trusting more. It's about stepping into the breakthrough Jesus has already opened up for us. Okay? And I think Thomas shows us what we need to have happen in our lives that sets us up so that we can step into the breakthrough that He's opened up for us to live in. Okay? Now to see that, let's get back into this moment. Jesus has risen from the dead, and He's appeared to His disciples that first Easter Sunday night. But Thomas isn't there. He's MIA. We don't know where he's at. He's off the reservation somewhere, right? The rest of Jesus' disciples, they find Him, and they begin to tell Him, man, you are not going to believe this, but we saw Jesus. And Thomas says, you're right. I don't believe it, right? And Jesus' disciples, though they're persistent, but Thomas, man, it is the truth. And so they keep telling him this, and it's about then that Thomas issues this declaration and really this test and this challenge. Unless I see the nail marks and I put my fingers there, and unless I see the wound in His side where the spear was and I shove my hand up inside of it, I will not believe. Okay? And a week later, Jesus' disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them, and He said, peace be with you. And then He said to Thomas, so put your finger here and see my hand. Reach up and put your hand in my side. Stop doubting, and believe. Right? So can you picture this moment in your mind's eye? Can you place yourself there in that room? Jesus enters the room. He speaks peace to his disciples, and immediately he makes his way across the room and stands in front of Thomas. Jesus rolls up his sleeve, and he reveals where the nails were driven through. And as he does, he says, Thomas, would you like to put your finger in it? Not only that, Jesus begins to untuck his robe. Do you get that? Jesus is partially undressing. The God of the universe is undressing so that Thomas, this mere man, can inspect him. Wow. And as he does, he shows Thomas and the rest of the disciples where the spear had been thrust into his side. And Thomas, would you like to put your hand in that? Thomas, if this is what it takes. And as Thomas takes all of that in, I have to believe Jesus' words came back to him from John 15, verses 13 really and 14. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And I love the next part. And you are my friends, Jesus says, if you do what I command. Right? The first thing that Thomas saw when he saw Jesus were the marks of the cross, the wounds of his great sacrifice, and more than that, it's the proof of his great love. And that's really the first truth that Thomas shows us, that the way to breakthrough begins when we see Jesus' love for us. When we see Jesus' love, right? Now, I know we like to rib Thomas. He's the doubter, but the truth is every single one of Jesus' followers that day, every single one of them only believed in him because they saw Jesus and really because they saw his love for them. So you could look at Mary Magdalene, who was in the garden. She's weeping, she's crying. Jesus speaks her name to comfort her. And when she sees Jesus and his love, she believes. The 10 other disciples later that night, they experienced it when Jesus appears in the room, and instead of chastising them and berating them for abandoning him, Jesus speaks peace, and they see his love. Later, there's a moment with Peter that John tells us about on the shore of the Sea of Galilee where Jesus offers forgiveness with a side of fish. I think we could put it that way. Here we see it with Thomas, as Jesus humbles himself so that Thomas can inspect him. Jesus does it all because he knows that to experience breakthrough faith, we need to clearly see his massive love for us. And you know what? We need that just as much as any of those first followers did. We need that. And while we may not see Jesus face to face, while we may not be able to put our fingers into the nail prints and our hand maybe into his side, the truth is that we still experience and see his love. Now, in my own life, I experienced it first through my parents. Jesus saved my parents before I was born, brought them to Ottawa, Illinois, where they raised us in the Church of the Nazarene, raised my family in church, right? And my parents kept pointing me to Jesus. They kept loving me into the kingdom. I felt it in the times that I spent with my youth pastor, Bud. And I don't know how many times he just put up with me hanging out with him. I know from experience now as a pastor, he had a whole lot of work to do. And yet he kept putting up with this young teenage punk. And he would put me to work. He'd have me doing all sorts of things with him, but Bud loved me. God's love was shown in dozens of cards from the Note Care Ministry when I went to college, and people that I really didn't even know from my church were writing about how they missed me. They were praying for me. God's love was seen in plate after plate after plate of chocolate chip cookies that Marge and Lois, my first grade Sunday school teachers, made me throughout the years of my growing up. And while I have never seen the face of Jesus, while I've never had the chance to put my fingers in the nail marks or my hand in his side, I've seen his love shown to me 1,000 times over by his people. Have you seen that in your life? Are you living out his love for other people to see? Because this is where breakthrough faith begins, the moment that we clearly see his love for us. Now here's the deal. It's not just Jesus' love that Thomas sees in this moment. There's more. So let's get back into this again, right? So it's a week after Easter. The 11 disciples have gathered. Remember, Judas is no more. Suddenly, Jesus appears in their midst. He begins to make his way over to Thomas. As he does, Thomas looks and he sees the wounds of the cross, the proof of Jesus' great sacrifice, his love for us. But at the same time, it's undeniable that Jesus isn't dead anymore. That he's very much alive and well, right? He's risen from the dead. It's not some ghost or aberration. This is Jesus in the flesh, because you can't touch a ghost. It's not some mass hallucination, but it's Jesus for real. It's Jesus in all of his glory. He's victorious over sin and death and the grave. I mean, it's the worst that this life and the enemy of our souls could ever throw at us. Jesus has destroyed their power, their hold on us, and as Thomas takes all this in, he can't help but see the massive power of God on display. And that's really what brings us to the next truth here. What Thomas shows us that the way to break through in our lives is when we experience the power of God, when that takes shape, right? We experience the power of God, breakthrough can begin to take shape. It's when we really begin to see his greatness, his almightiness, his immenseness, his glory. There's an old song we used to sing as kids growing up. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you've sung it. My God is so big, and you put your arms out way like this, right? So strong and so mighty. I'm on video now, and it's going to be really awkward. This is great, right? Some of us can flex really big, and then there's people like me, and you're like, yeah, it's really all about God flexing. That's the moment here. And then you go, there's nothing my God cannot do. And then our favorite part, boom, boom. I just freaked out the kids, right? They're like, what is going on up there? And as you say boom, boom, you stamp your feet super loud, because again, just like the flexing, it's not about your muscles, it's about God. And when our massive God's feet hit the ground, everything starts shaking up. Okay? The song is simple, but it's great in its simplicity. My God is so big, so strong, and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do. Boom, boom. Right? We need to be reminded how big and great and awesome our God is. We need to be reminded of that constantly, because in this world, man, life just has a way of shifting our focus. So we no longer sing confidently, my God is so big, but we begin to moan, my problem's so big, so strong, and so mighty. Right? There's nothing that anyone can do. Pity me. Right? That's what we start to sing. Yeah, I know we don't use those words, but that's how we start living life, all because we've lost focus of who God is. Like Thomas, we need to experience his power and just let that reality wash over us fresh and anew. I've been reading in Isaiah. I just finished up Isaiah in my personal time with the Lord. I love how Isaiah caught glimpses of God's power. Chapter 40 is a great place to just kind of read through that. Here's just a few things that Isaiah points to. One of them is this, the ocean. We're told that the oceans of the world contain more than 340 quintillion gallons of water. That's 340, if you could picture that number, 340, and 18 zeros after it. Okay? And yet this is what we're told, that God holds it all in the hollow of his hand, that small little divot that happens when you cup your hands. We're told that the earth is about 6 sextillion metric tons. Don't ask me when they pulled out the scale and held it up, okay? I have no idea when that happened. But picture the number 6 with 21 zeros after it, tons, okay? That's our approximate. Now, all I need to know is that's pretty big and that's pretty massive, because I don't weigh anywhere near that much, thank God, right? But then there's God. That seems pretty massive, but then there's God, and this is what we read in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 15. He picks up the whole earth as if it were a grain of sand. Now that's quite the perspective on size, isn't it? Or there's this one, the known universe. If you go out and there's no lights around, I love that. You can see the Milky Way just stretching across. I love that. I got an app on my phone that tells me where all the constellations are, and we can just lay out in the backyard and look at that. And the known universe, we're told, stretches on for 46 billion light years. That's over 270 sextillion miles. Okay, so that's 270 with 21 zeros after it. So can you picture that? Yeah, me neither. I have no idea how big that is. Okay, but picture this. Because the Bible tells us in Isaiah 40, verse 12, that God measures the universe in the span of his hand. So he holds up his hand like we would, and we're like, yeah, that's about right. That's how massive your God is. Are you seeing it now? Are you starting to see his power more clearly? Are you starting to see him more clearly? Because the truth is that you and I really do belong to a God who is beyond what the word big even describes. A God who is beyond strong and beyond mighty. There is absolutely nothing that our God cannot do. And so don't come and talk to me and say, Pastor, there's no hope in my situation, because you belong to a God who wants to bring breakthrough into your life. And he can do all things. Amen? Amen. Man, we need that. No more wimpy Christian crying. We belong to a God who could do all things. And that's really the next step that he brings us to. The last truth that Thomas shows us. Because it's not just that he saw Jesus' love and that he saw the wounds. It's not just that in the moment he's like, wow, Jesus is very much alive and I'm seeing his massive power. But there's this point too, the beginning of verse 27. I want you to say this with me. Then Jesus said to Thomas, okay, now just hold there. He goes on, he says, put your finger here, put your hand in my side, stop doubting and believe, right? But it's this first part that really should capture us, that Jesus came personally to Thomas. The God of the universe moved across the room to his struggling disciple. And it wasn't to chastise Thomas and say, man, just get in gear with the program. What is wrong with you? It was to invite him to come close, to examine, to be sure. And here's the next truth that we need to see. The way to breakthrough takes shape in our lives when we realize Jesus is personally moving to reach me. It's not some abstract theory. It's not just that he loves everyone, but he loves me. It's not just that he is massive and he's big, but you know what? He's using that because he wants to reach me. Hold you and me. Right. And he won't settle for anything less than this intimate relationship with you and me. I love how Jesus describes himself. He calls himself the Good Shepherd. He says that we are his sheep. And then he goes on and he says, you know what, if one of my sheep were to stray away, I don't give up on it if they find themselves lost or if they're far away. I don't expect them to find our way back. You know what else he doesn't do? He doesn't just stand and grumble around and say, stupid sheep, wandered off again. Right? No, he tells us, I leave my flock, they're safe. I leave them and I make my way to find that one that is lost. He beats his way cross country to find us, to reach us, to rescue us, to bring us home. Jesus is all about reaching you. That's the whole reason he came. That's his purpose behind living and dying and rising again, was to reach you. He moved heaven and earth just to reach you. And still today, he personally comes to us. And he invites us to come close to him. Do you have doubts? Well, then come and examine me. Inspect me. Be sure of me, Jesus says. And here's the greatest part. He's already sure of you. Man, he wants you in his life. He loves you with an everlasting love. This is what took shape in Thomas's life. Right? We can bullet it out on the screen. But this is what happened. There was this collision of the love of Jesus and the power of Jesus and this personal reach of Jesus. And when that collision happens, breakthrough opens up in our lives. And we can now step into it and live in it. And it's this moment when that took shape in Thomas's life, something inside flipped and he was changed. His situation didn't really change, but his position and his perspective sure did. Because the conflict and the confusion and even the crisis that he'd been facing that held him down, well, that was still out there. None of that had power over Thomas anymore, because breakthrough inside had taken place. This moment where there was this collision of the love of Jesus and the power of Jesus and the personal reach of Jesus. And in this moment, Jesus truly became Thomas's Lord and leader, Thomas's God, the one who is more than enough. And it's that breakthrough faith that God has for you today. It's more important that God changes you inside than that he changes your situation. And that begins when we see his love for us, his great sacrifice for us. It begins when we experience his power. When we take in the resurrection, when we see how God has moved in our lives to provide for us and move for us, how he's defeated anything and everything that could ever come against us that would tear us from him or hold us down, that he is the victorious one. He's overcome everything for us. He's so big, beyond strong, beyond mighty. Right? We need to experience that. But you also need to see that he's made his way to you. Here in this moment. And when you take that in, wow. Now there's the potential for you to step into the breakthrough that he's already opened up for you. Do you see it? Now there's the potential for change inside of you. Where like Thomas, we respond in full worship and full surrender. And we declare to Jesus, you are my Lord. Not just Lord in the abstract, you are my Lord. You're the leader of my life. I absolutely trust in you. And you are not just God in the abstract, but you are my God. You are everything to me. You are all that I need. Oh. We need to experience that breakthrough. Because we all live life in this world. And in this world, you're going to face obstacles and challenges and hardships and troubles. And how we respond is what matters. How we live in that moment. And it's this breakthrough faith that God wants to bring inside of you and me that helps us to rise up in the moment and to live our lives so that He receives the glory that He deserves, so that our lives show Him off to everyone around us and everyone can see that the only reason we're moving and breathing and thriving in the midst of what we're going through is because He's the one that's lifting us up to overcome. He's the one who is strengthening us to stand firm when everything is shaky in our lives. He's the one who's pouring His love into us so that even in the midst of a lot of broken stuff going on, we're still able to love the people around us because His love is overflowing. He's the one who gave His life so that we might live and thrive in Him today. You hearing me? God wants to do a massive work in your life today. And He's opened the way for breakthrough. The question is, will you step into it and will you live in it?